Welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Michael Bruntz, Brian Christopherson. We are Husker247, and we're here to talk to you today about Nebraska football. Brian Christopherson, Michael Bruntz, we're both at the Saturday, what do we want to call it? Open scrimmage? There's a name for it. Do you guys remember the actual name? I should give the actual name of the practice.
Big Red Preview, I think.
There we go. All right. You guys were at the Big Red Preview. You were able to put your eyes on the team for the first time this fall. And so I think to start the show here, we're just going to we'll just let you guys just kind of go back and forth. Bruntz, we'll start with you. Give us a few things that you saw from Saturday that stood out for you. We'll have you start on the offensive side of the ball. We'll go to BC on defense. And then from there, we'll kind of figure out what else we want to mention.
Yeah, I think the first thing, Nebraska looks different at the skill positions. I think that was my big takeaway was, you look at the wide receivers, and I'm always a little bit not negative, but a little bit skeptical whenever people start talking about wide receiver depth in the spring. And there's, I think, probably 7 or 8 guys right now that you'd feel pretty good about throwing in there if you had to, and feeling like you'd get something out of them. I think running back is kind of the same way, where you almost have 2 groups of guys, and it's, kind of your top group of Ramir Johnson, Gabe Ervin, and Emmett Johnson, and then you have Dowdell and those other guys, Quentin Ives, in that second group. I think that was my big takeaway. It was like Nebraska has done a really nice job of filling that gap at certain spots. And I think, wide receiver especially, you really have to kind of be positive about what the long-term look is for this season, given the additions of Jamal Banks and Isaiah Nair. I think those are 2 huge pieces of the puzzle. And from at least my moderately trained eye, looked like both of those guys had pretty good chemistry already with Dylan Raiola.
Yeah. BC, what'd you see on defense?
I'll start with the secondary because right before the scrimmage, Rule had like a 10 to 15 minute press conference, and he was sort of speaking about that cornerback position, and he was asked specifically about Sire Wright. And I'm not diminishing what Wright could possibly do in this competition. We're very early, but he brought up Larry Tarver and Amari Sanders. And obviously, consider that Tommy Hill wasn't out there in this practice, and Bly Hill is still recovering. So 2 key pieces weren't on the field. But Amari and Larry Tarver definitely jumped out to me then, too, after hearing their names. Of course, you're looking for them, but you're like, okay, these guys are in the competition along with Jeremiah Charles, for the 2 deep, at least, at that position. And it also brought me down the road to just the storyline with these Miami guys from this class is really interesting this year. Like, you could talk, we know Ja'Cory Barney is going to play on offense, but a Tarver or Sanders, could they be heard from in some way this season? Maybe not right away, but find a role. Willis McGahee's out there, and they talked to his parents. They were interviewed at the stadium, like on the big board during the proceedings. And I was just thinking, like, this is really interesting because for like 5 to 6 years there, people would hear all about recruiting in Florida, and then guys just left without anything ever happening. And in front of our eyes, it appears that at least with this particular class, there's real potential to have a very high hit rate with those like 5 guys they got. And so that's really interesting to me. The depth on the D line, we all know about, and it shows like when they line up, it's hard for the offense to run the ball against them. And you'll see like even Vincent Carroll Jackson pop in and make a play, and you're thinking like, where's he sit in this? So a guy who could be 7th or 8th or 9th on the D line is in there making plays, and you're like, yeah, that is really a group that should be formidable and looks like it will back up what people are thinking. So those are kind of my thoughts on the defense at first. It kind of goes to that secondary competition and how that's all going to pan out. And there are going to be a couple young guys who have to be heard from, and we saw a few of them flash on Saturday.
Adding to the Sanders Tarver thing, did I read correctly that one is number 14, the other is number 41?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Sanders is 14 right now, and Tarver's 41. It was cool though. I mean, Tarver was lined up against Ja'Cory like on some routes, and I mean that's just fun. Like two guys from Miami, and here they are in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they're both trying to make it happen earlier. People might forget Tarver was like somebody who like Malcolm Hartzog and other guys were kind of touting in the winter conditioning stuff, like watch out for him. And then he suffered an injury in the spring, but he's bounced back, so he's in the mix. I'm not trying to say those names to overhype like they're going to be out there right away. I just think it is really interesting at cornerback in the secondary. There are going to be like a couple guys, I think, who are first year players who at some point this season are going to have to be heard from. And obviously they got a fresh start just because they're new here, but also everybody's got a fresh start with John Butler now kind of analyzing it in his own way.
Was Tarver on the outside or did he play much in the slot? The reason I ask is that one of the things that came up last year is Nebraska was trying to flip him from Maryland. Our analyst down in Florida, Andrew Ivins, talked about how he's a really good slot cornerback. He feels he's a guy that would translate pretty well to the next level of being able to play at the inside, can turn his hips, can run sideline to sideline, and doesn't necessarily have to rely on the boundary. And he thought that's what made him one of the more unique guys in terms of defensive backs in the 24 class.
Yeah, I guess I saw him just on the outside in the one drill I was at, but I mean, I don't want to say that's all it is. But speaking of, it's with like Marquise Buford and Malcolm Hartzog, they've got options because of their versatility. Like during the practice, Buford was basically at one of the corner spots, and then you had Hartzog, Gifford, and Singleton sort of in the safety rover with Jeremiah Charles at the other corner spot. Of course, Tommy Hill was out. So that gives you kind of a lay of the land of maybe like the 5 or 6 guys who are at the top. Obviously, Jeremiah Charles, I'm not bringing up the other guys to say he's not right there because he was with the top unit. But Amari Sanders did have an interception off a play where it was actually tipped by Ishmael Smith-Flores, now working at Jack linebacker. And I think Bruntz would second this. Keona Davis is another guy who, if we're talking defense, I'm not saying he's going to play right away, but just really impressive at 270 pounds. Like that looks like a steal just off the bus guy for a first year player, how he's built already. And you can tell Terrence Knighton's already coaching him up close. I'm not so sure he won't see a little time this season at some point, whether it's the 4-game rule or whatever, but he's a guy to keep an eye on.
What's kind of fun about the way recruiting works now is that you get 20 of these guys committed by the time August starts. And then think about a couple of these names we've talked about here in Larry Tarver and Keona Davis. They're some of the more late high school additions to the class. I mean, Keona Davis was someone when we were writing about him, he was Keona Wilhite. And so then that has threw me for a loop when that name first came up. This was a guy that was committed to go to Washington, and he was going to go play for Kalen DeBoer. And obviously everything happened there. And Nebraska was very, very quick to point out to him when it all went down with Kalen DeBoer. Hey, we had talked with you a little bit in the spring, in the summer. It didn't seem like there was much interest there. Want you to know you got an option here. They're able to get him in for a visit. I think it was during a snowstorm in January. And they walked away with a really interesting commitment there, and a guy that sort of helped mitigate the loss of a Carlin Jones, if you think about it.
Yeah, he definitely did. And I think at the time there were a lot of people, like late in January who Schaefer were like, well, do they really need that? They were looking at the numbers. It's like, it's a full roster. Why? And why is because whenever there's talent out there you think can come in and make a difference in a year or two, you go get it and you figure it out later. And that's what Keona Davis is. So they've got some really interesting pieces on that D line beyond the main guys we all talk about. So, I mean, James Williams is bigger, obviously. Knighton still calls him skinny, kind of at 250, but he's definitely put on weight to try to be more of an every down guy. And I think what's interesting is Jamari Butler's listed at 260 now, and he said he was playing at 230 last season. Lenhart's gained 10 pounds also and looks a lot bigger. And Knighton said something the other day about maybe you can play those guys both on the field at the same time, and maybe you can play them on earlier downs now, which you couldn't do in the past, somewhat because of their size. And because of some of these guys' gains in the offseason, it actually opens up like a lot more flexibility and options for how Tony White maneuvers the pieces in certain down and distance situations, I think, compared to a season ago. And so that's sort of a sidebar to keep track of as we get into this season, where certain guys maybe fit in downs where they weren't playing previously.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I've been as bullish as I am on the upcoming season is you get that second year of Corey Campbell, the full year of the strength and conditioning and the workouts and building the body towards, what they want. Combine that with the nutrition. And so you're talking about some of these guys on the defensive line. I mean, Javen Wright fits in that category too. He had 25 pounds. And so he's not playing at, 190 pounds or 195 pounds. He's up over 200, well over 200. You saw him. I mean, that photo that has been on our site has popped up in multiple threads. You've got just a big bicep. And I mean, he doesn't look like the high school cornerback and safety that he was when he came here 5 years ago. And so I think that one of the things that's going to be really interesting is how that strength and conditioning manifests itself in terms of what Nebraska can do on deep. Like, it looks and sounds like they could be a more physically aggressive team and can hold up in different ways than maybe they were able to last year. And last year they were pretty good. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on. Speaking of Javen Wright, we talked about the secondary, talked about the defensive line. What did you see from that second level? There are a lot of bodies in that linebacker room, in that linebacker mix. And it's hard to get away from the idea that John Bullock is going to be quintessential to what's going on Nebraska's defense. What else have you seen in that linebacker area?
Yeah, slept on storyline is probably John Bullock became such a story in the offseason last year, but then we tend to forget, like, okay, that was his first year playing linebacker, and he jumped right into it at that level to play that many snaps. That's hard to do. And so obviously he said it himself in an interview last week with media that he's way more confident this year than he was a season ago. He just flat out said that. So I think you're going to see more from his game than he was probably able to exhibit a season ago. I think Mekhi Bayor is going to be obviously critical, but yeah, Javen Wright. I mean, I think of those guys first, but then Vincent Shavers, to me, you think of like Rob Dvorak in an interview he had where he kind of implied it's just tough to keep a guy like that off the field. I'm paraphrasing, but I just think he's going
another
to be
Miami guy, right?
Yep. So Shavers, throw him in that. Yeah, he's one of those five. And
the Miami Mafia, is that what we're going to call him?
I don't know what we want to call him, but I mean, you think about it, like all three, at least three of the five, I could see playing important snaps this season. And I could see the ones who don't being on the cusp of it for next year. Like McGahee, maybe Willis McGahee isn't going to pop in right away this year because you've got MJ Sherman and Princewell at that jack spot, but perhaps that's just a year away. So yeah, I think that group is definitely going to be heard from, but those are the linebackers that come to my mind first. Bullock, Bayor, Javen Wright, Shavers. I could be forgetting some. Vince Genatone's working there. And
right. Where does a guy like Stephon Thompson, who came from Syracuse, where does he fit into the mix? I've had a tough time since he's been on the roster. I mean, it felt like all of spring you didn't really know exactly which of the position groups in that linebacker room that he was going to be a part of. He's got the history of Tony White. He has as much experience as anybody on that second level. That's a guy that I've been a little curious about.
I am too. I haven't sensed the momentum there.
Same.
But maybe that's an example where you never know. Sometimes in camp in August, there's that second to third week bump where somebody like makes that charge. It's close to the show now. And we have heard about Stephon, and it shows in his numbers at Syracuse that he's a gamer. And some guys sort of like when it's that moment, they rise up and it's like, okay, we got to play this guy now. even if there were some bumps in the road along the way there. But at this moment, as we're doing this podcast and watching Saturday's scrimmage, I'll be honest, I didn't sense like he's like the second or third guy. I didn't walk away thinking that, so
that's interesting.
But we'll see if that changes or if we are just reading that wrong.
Well, and it's hard to know, right? But it's also one of those things where it speaks to just having that time in the system probably helps some of those guys. It also speaks to you can go grab a piece out of the transfer portal and it may just not go how it looks like it's going to on paper. I mean, obviously we got to have everything play out here, but he's just one of those names that I keep waiting to hear more about, and you just haven't so far.
Mm-hmm.
Bruntz, I think, is having some technical issues, so you got to play double duty here. We've seen Dylan Raiola a few times now. What did you take away from Saturday watching him? You can talk about the quarterbacks as a whole, or if you want, you can solely focus on Dylan Raiola. I'll leave that up. This is a BC discretion moment.
Well, I probably struggle with this a little bit. I kind of assume everybody else assumes that Dylan is going to be the starter, and we're just working under that premise. And so sometimes I'll come back from Saturday, or we'll write up our Cliff Notes on what we saw, and I'll already assume that everybody understands that we think, and most people think he's one, and there's a gap between him and two. And then I'll see other places like he'll pop up like, oh, here's the guy. It's like, yeah. I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like we know.
You mean it's not the biggest scoop out there?
Yeah, it's like everybody is under that working premise, I thought, So like there was nothing I took from Saturday. It's like, oh, there's a gap between 1 and 2. This is stunning. It's like, yeah, of course there was. There is one. They got to keep Dylan healthy at all costs, I think it's important. I think Harburg has his own skill set, which I've always said, that where I think you could get stuff done with it. It would be maybe different than how it looks under Dylan, but he's obviously still got that running component where he could take off and be a problem. And I do think he's improved as a thrower. And then after those two, I just think it's hazy, like I don't know who's actually the third guy, if Gramstad could make a play at that third spot or not. The
hope is you don't need your third quarterback.
Yeah. Or Danny. Danny's growing in the system, and he's a true freshman. He's like,
he needs time.
Dylan is, I think, a rare breed for his age. I think we all agree on that with like his tools and just like what he can do. And most guys, it's going to take a little time. So I think Danny needs a little time to keep growing in it. And I don't know if Jalen, with his smarts of just being a 22-year-old guy who's played a lot of ball, could help you out like in a pinch there. That we've been a little bit slower on that one than some others. I think there's a huge jump from the NAIA level to where he is now. But that'll be interesting who kind of emerges as a third guy there. But I thought Dylan looked good. And Bruntz is right. The receivers look good. The guy who just jumps out at you is Carter Nelson. And this is like, you could say that was obvious. We all knew that. But there is something to be said for if you look at our photo of him like standing next to Thomas Fidone, and it's like the same, it's like he just looks like a dude who's been in the program for 4 years already. And the way
and he got there in June. I mean, he was not an early enrollee. He was there in June. Like that's the thing about Carter Nelson, and part of why I've been a little slow to even the idea that I think he could still end up redshirting. But he's got so much talent. It's hard to do that. I mean, he's transitioning from 8-man to 11-man. He's transitioning to playing wide receiver exclusively. This is a guy that played quarterback mostly for Ainsworth. The fascinating thing about him is that with his size, you wouldn't think open field runner. That guy can move. Like, I mean, it's just he's a freak. I mean, there's really, you don't like to say that because it seems like it's insulting in some ways, but he is a genetic lottery winner in a way that very few 18, 19-year-olds ever are.
I think he'll blow through the red shirt. I mean, I just do. And I sometimes for a guy like him where you can see like there's such a trajectory that's obvious for him, it's like, why why worry about the red shirt
Yeah.
piece really? Like, you might only have, this is really hype, but
Whoa!
well, I'm just saying you might only have them for 4 years at the most.
Okay.
So
I thought you were going to say 3 years.
yeah, I'll say 4, but get all of it. Get all of it you can out of that. So I think he's going to play a lot. And another guy just throw in there, because this is what Saturday was kind of about, is Keelan Smith. Was popping out there, not like with the top receivers were Nair, Banks, and Bonner, who everybody talks over Bonner, but he's always out there with the first group. And then within that drive, they mixed in Garcia Castaneda, and they also mixed in Keelan Smith. Now, I don't know, maybe, where those guys fit in comparison with the guys who came out with the twos, like Coleman and Carter Nelson came out with the second unit. But I did notice Keelan Smith out there in drills very early on some of that stuff. And that was interesting to me, just as a guy to kind of keep in mind in the background.
Yeah, that wide receiver room, I mean, Bruntz hit on it before he departed, but that is a loaded room. I mean, it is. You think back to what things look like in 2020, 2019, even 2021. It's just a different looking room altogether there. I'd be remiss, and we were already 21 and a half minutes into this podcast, and we haven't even discussed this yet. Teddy Prochazka tears an ACL, done for the year. BC, we've been doing this a long time. You've been doing it longer than I have. I have to say, that one hit me differently just because he was so damn excited last week. Like to be able to sit and talk with him the way that we did a week ago, and he's at the podium for 20 minutes and he's talking and he's going through just like what it's been like for him, the mental side of it, just being able to not have to be in the trainer's room, to not have to focus on coming back from something, to not have to wonder, how his knee was going to respond, to then 4 days later, or 5 days later, the worst possible thing happens for him. I feel really bad for Teddy Prochazka. I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had about what happens next for Nebraska at left tackle, and we're going to have that conversation. But that's just a brutal injury to a guy who's already been through a lot.
You think about these guys get up at like 5 a.m. when it's like 4 degrees outside in January, and they go to these drills and stuff, and it's all build up toward August, and it's here, and you can feel it in the air. And then within a week of practice, when something like that happens, it's just like such a kick to your teeth, like it and for Teddy, of course, at the top, but I think just everybody feels it with him, like a guy who's had, 3 or 4 of these now. This is like the third one where has to go.
Third major knee injury.
Yeah. In the surgery. And he worked so hard on his body. Like I really felt like had shifted, like how Bryce kind of changed his body last year. Ben Hart
used it as an example when he talked about it. Yeah.
It seemed like Teddy was on that same path, and it was going to be exciting to see what he could do. But just personally, like to see him get to play fully and try to realize his potential as a local kid. Yeah, it was a tough one. I was hoping that kind of Monday was swirling in the wind, and we thought it was true. And you're just hoping like someone had bad information, that's getting passed down the chain, but it wasn't, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so now that leads us to this conversation. Turner Corcoran's the next man up, and in theory, I mean, he was already working with the ones on Saturday.
Yeah, he was.
And Turner does not lack for experience. What Turner has, in my opinion, lacked has been success at the left tackle spot. Do you have? Is there anything in your brain or anything that you can think of that would give you renewed optimism for a guy who has struggled greatly at that left tackle position? I mean, this is you mentioned when we talked about Dylan Raiola, you got to keep him healthy at all costs. Your blindside protector has really struggled against speed rushers throughout his career and has not played well at left tackle. And this is what you have going forward. And it's not like you have a great alternative beyond Turner Corcoran either.
The story of Bryce Benhart maybe is one you look at and say, we thought we had the book on him after 3 or 4 years, and we didn't. He changed the script, and there's always the possibility for guys to do that. We've seen it even Schaefer with some guys who were sort of had okay Husker careers, and then suddenly like Zach Sterup or somebody, like they kind of find it at age 22, 23, and they're like, getting a chance in the pros. So maybe this is a point where Corcoran does take off. And I guess the good part of this is he is a guy who's played as much football as about anybody on that line. And so that's good. But this is a reminder. We talk like it's easy, like in March or May or June, to be like, oh, okay, they're so deep, at this position and that position. And you always see how tenuous that is when like one key guy goes down, in August, because then suddenly everybody starts looking at it a different way when that big name is off the board. And they're like, okay, now we're here. And then what if something happened there? Like, who's next after that? And so you have Gunnar Gatula, who's a young player, second year guy who's getting some reps, it sounds like, with the top unit. Tyler Knack's a guy who's kind of moved, I think, to guard and tackle and has done a little of both, but he's had a good off season. So maybe his name starts to be more prominent. You've got guys in the wings like Grant Bricks and stuff, but the whole idea was they have like a year or two to grow. And so it is a little worrisome. I think this is that first point in the offseason where there's that injury that kind of hits you when you talk about the depth chart, where you don't walk quite as confidently or talk quite as confidently after this blow for Nebraska. This is also the time of year where they're getting better as a team, but it's like nothing good as far as the headlines can come out in the next week or two. You know what I mean? It's like we're in that point where you're just trying to avoid being that team that has 3, 4, 5 of these things that pop up. And that does sometimes happen in camp across the country. And you're just hoping you can avoid that happening a lot. Roger Gradney was another injury, ACL, linebacker, freshman. Maybe was going to take a little time to play, but good player they liked a lot, and he's going to be out now this year too.
BC, we got a few minutes left here in the pod. One of the things we were going to do, Bruntz is not here, so you get all the reps. You don't get to sit one out and take a mental rep. You're just taking all the reps now.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a player. You tell me whether you think through this offseason, stock up, stock down, or holding steady. And then you can give your rationale. Does that sound good?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. We'll start with a guy that we've already mentioned, we've already talked about. I already know which way you're going to go with it, but I want to give you a chance to expand upon it. Javen Wright.
Yeah, stock up because, he looks the part, but also I say this all the time. He's one of the 3 or 4 on defense, I think, who's like a game wrecker type player with his athleticism. Like he's that guy who can force a fumble on a sack and running it back the other way. Like I can envision that in my mind with him involved. I can't remember the game last year, but remember it was one of those October ones, I think, where he was involved in like 2 or 3 turnovers. Like he punched the ball out inside the 5 yard.
Northwestern? It
might have been like he knocked the ball out inside the 5. It might have even been one of those losses like against Maryland or somebody. But he's definitely had games like that where he's shown that possibility. And I just think there's more out there for him. I think he knows there is. And he's got an NFL type body. He's one of those guys who, if you were told and didn't know anything about him, that guy could play at the next level by somebody, you'd say, yeah, that looks like right to me. That's how he looks.
I'm going to give you a guy that I know that you like, but I feel like we haven't heard a lot about him. And maybe he's being slept on a little bit. Where are things at with Marquise Buford? Stock up, stock down, holding steady?
I guess steady. I mean, it could be stock up too, but steady for me because I just think he's like plugged right back into where you expect him to be. And now we see where he takes his game. Like it's up to him to show that he can take his play to that where we're talking about him. Like, could he be like a 3rd team all conference player or something like that? I think he's so critical because he's just he has so much as far as football smarts go that you can't take that for granted at that safety spot. And so it's really nice for Nebraska right now that you have him, Singleton, and Gifford, who you just feel like they've got such big football brains. And that's that position where if you are really into your details and you're doing what you're supposed to, you avoid those explosive plays. And that's what they did really well last year. Omar Brown was really good at, keeping Nebraska from having any catastrophes on the back end. And I think Marquise and his knowledge can help sort of carry off where they were with that.
I was going to give you an individual specialist, and then I decided I'm going to break my own game and give you the entirety of special teams. Stock up, stock down, holding steady.
I guess I'd say stock down, just from what we've seen. And I'm not hitting the siren on it by any means. But you've got to get to the games and see a kicker who puts it between the pipes. And we don't know with Tristan Alvano, he's been out, for the start of fall camp as he recovers from this injury. That's not ideal for a guy who's coming off a 9-15 season and had a kind of a tough spring game where he missed 2 kicks. So they've got some young options who did okay. It looked like in the kicks they had in front of us Saturday. But I would say I'm a little worried about it until you see that they can do it in the games. And Buschini, of course, he's going to be a big wild card in this season. Like, he's got to be on. He's got to avoid the occasional, 18-yard miss hit that pops up every other week, that sort of stuff, and just be that guy who can pin teams deep on the 6-yard line or whatever and let this defense hunt. So I'll say stock down, not with the sense that they can't show that's different 3 weeks into the season, but they're going to have to prove it to everybody.
We'll give you another one that I think seems relatively easy based on how he's discussed and what the expectations are. Thomas Fidone.
Yeah, I think it's a stock up. I think a big reason is because of his quarterback. I just think because he's going to have better QB play, we're going to see more of what he can do. I thought Bruntz made a really good point like a week or so ago on one of these podcasts. If you go back and look at a lot of the catches Fidone had last season, he always was like trying to reach back here. And, like he didn't get a lot of catches where it's like on the run where he could excel like he did in high school.
He had one against Michigan State, and I think it was his long for the season. It was like a 35-yard, and they just hit him perfectly on like a 12-yard seam, and he took the other 23 himself. I mean, it gave you an example that he can be explosive too.
Yeah, I want to see that train get moving on the run on a few catches. And I also, beside a quarterback who you think is going to put it on target more, you have those receivers who I do think are better developed to threaten a defense with going, taking the home run ball into play. And that's going to open up the middle of the field, I think, for guys like Fidone. I think Jamal Banks can get a lot done, in the 8 to 15-yard range, catching passes. So definitely stock up. Part of it just because it's his second year healthy, but part of it because of the pieces around him, I think are going to complement him better and make him look better.
All right. I already broke the game earlier. We're going to do it again because I don't know how you separate any of these guys. How about the running back position? How are you feeling after the scrimmage, after everything you've heard from the spring, from what you feel or have seen? Running backs.
Steady. I think they're good. I think they can be good. No, good is just okay. Like, I think they are that. I think this is Nebraska.
Why not just say that I think they're okay then, if good is okay?
They're okay.
All right. Sorry.
I think they're okay. I think they could I think there's potential for one or two of them to show that it's more than that. Emmett Johnson, I really like more and more as this offseason's gone along. I've just grown into the idea that everybody tries to sometimes put the ceiling on him, hits here, and then he goes higher. And I think there's an opportunity for him to do that again this year. Ramir is going to have his say somehow. I don't know exactly how that role is going to be carved out, but he's going to make some big plays for this team. So I feel like they've got that. Now the question is, are they going to have that back who takes a play that's sort of a nothing play and gets 4 yards out of it? That's the thing that would make it great to me. Like, it's just getting those yards that you don't think are there, where you make your offensive line look better than they were on the play. You know, where there's those games where afterwards they had 260 yards rushing or something ridiculous. Everybody's like talking about the whole line. And then you actually go back and watch the film and the whole line was okay. But the running back.
2014 Miami, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Amir just doing it himself.
Yeah, we always use that one. But there are definitely games like that where you'll go back and be like, oh man, this running back made everybody look a lot better. So can they do that now is the question.
All right. That was stock up, stock down, holding steady. Was there anyone that you were really hoping to talk about? I'll give a bonus one. You can pick anybody and you can give your own stock.
I don't know. Do you have someone you think people are sleeping on, not necessarily us? We end up.
No, it's hard because we're in such a saturated media market. I feel like everyone gets discussed.
Exactly.
Through the nature of this podcast or the other interviews or stuff that I do. I feel like I've talked about this team a ton already. So no, I don't, and I'm trying to do the sleeper thing. And the guy that I'm going to be writing about for our website is Gunnar Gatula, and we've already mentioned him. So it's I don't feel like there's much that's being slept on with Nebraska football at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't even mention, and I'm not saying this as a criticism. It just tells you how deep the wide receiver room is. And maybe he was unavailable, and I've forgotten this. Was Jalen Lloyd unavailable for Saturday?
Yeah, he was.
Okay, so that's why you didn't mention. All right.
Yeah, he wasn't out there Saturday.
Because I anticipate that to be one of their top four wide receivers.
No, that's good. That's good that you got his name in the podcast. Hopefully people stayed with it so that they know that he was in there. I don't know. There's some guys like Elijah Judy who I think is
that whole defensive line room. I mean, I'm not going to be shocked, and you're not going to be shocked if there's a big play made by Sua Lefotu at some point this year, and that's not a guy that people were just thinking about. I fully expect Riley Van Poppel to be taking playing time away from Ty Robinson at some point this year. I mean, you mentioned Vincent Carroll Jackson, a guy that I know they really liked over there, because you can't teach 6'8". You can't teach that kind of strength that he has, and he's just learning how to play football. I mean, I really like what they have in the trenches on the defensive side. I really, really do.
Yeah. If you're trying to find people who don't get talked about enough, even though they get talked about some in our market, Nate Borkercher is an example of that. Like, he's a guy who's really important to this team. Like, Luke Lindenmeyer is a guy who will do dirty work that's going to matter. So there's those type of guys. But other than that, you're right. Like, everybody at some point gets their headline, and that's one of the things Rule wisely cites. Like he embraces Nebraska media, I think, in the fact that, hey, you get covered here. If you want to go play somewhere where
no one knows you.
Yeah, no one knows you, or you get something written or said about you every 3-4 years, have at it. Here, you might not even end up on the too deep when it counts, but there's some point in March or April where somebody probably wrote a full story about you and like how you can impact things. And so I think that's a useful tool for them to use. That's very true also.
Here's a name that I kind of forgot about because he got hurt last year. And I was listening to the MJ Sherman audio, and he's running through the Jack room. And I don't know that he's going to be a factor into much this year, but he's someone that I still have, expectations for. Maverick Noonan.
Yeah.
Like, there's a guy that, it wouldn't shock me if at some point in, say, late September, early October, there's Maverick Noonan out on the field making a play because he's done so well in practice that Tony White wanted to reward him with the opportunity to get some reps, in a game. And so, that's when we talk about this team being deeper, I think some of it is that. Like, they have some guys that, a little bit further down that you kind of forget about because when they have had injuries, other people have stepped up. You don't need to, you haven't had to think about Maverick Noonan because he's probably running third or fourth at the jack spot right now. And that's not an insult to him. That's just the reality of having MJ Sherman, Prince Umambi Ellen in front of you, and then competing with Jordan Ochoa and some other guys as well.
Yeah, Ochoa's over there. That's a good name. Offensive line, you could do that too. I mean, like Brock like Sledge, Knutson. I mean, these guys, maybe their time is next year, but doesn't mean they're not doing okay behind the scenes. And if Gunnar Gatula gets called on for some big snaps or somebody like that, we do have to remember, Teddy Prohaska, he was a second-year college guy. I think redshirt freshman when he got put in right in 21, and he kind of took off for a few games.
And
then
Prohaska was a true freshman.
True freshman, that's right. Yeah. And he played a few games, and unfortunately had one of those injuries. But an example of it can be done. Sometimes you get into this frame of mind where you got to be in your third, fourth year to make a difference on the O-line. But there might be a case or two where someone has to show, no, that's not how it has to be, and it steps up into the moment. We'll see if that happens.
And it's not always the guys that you think it's going to be either, because Justin Evans seems like he's going to end up being a starter at Nebraska, and that was not someone that I would have anticipated was going to be a multi-year player in this position. I mean, he was a late ad that, I think Donovan Raiola gets credit for, and I know it's sacrilegious to give him much credit for things. It was a guy Scott Frost really wanted.
Yeah, he did.
Scott Frost went, pounded on the table, stood on the table. We know people like to stand on the table for these types of things, and basically said, hey, I want this kid. And even our analysts at 24/7, like, a lot of people are backing off. Nebraska seems to be really interested in him. And lo and behold, several years later, he's going to be your starting left guard.
He's old school. He's kind of, he gets downgraded by people on the surface because he's not as tall and stuff like that. But he's got that wrestling background, and he's great at leverage. You talk to like Ty Robinson and Nash, they'll tell you he's like one of the toughest dudes to go against on the O-line. And it does sound like Micah Mazuka has kind of put some things together, and Latovsky's out for a couple of weeks, but you'll get him back hopefully before the opener. The interior looks fine to me. It's that tackle spot that I think was a little bit of a question even before the injury, and now you're like, all right, let's see what they can do with not knowing exactly how those options are gonna sit on the first depth chart. I'm really curious what that first depth chart's going to look like at some of the tackle and who's like the fourth tackle now and all that stuff.
That'll be a fun game. How many oars are on the depth chart?
Yeah, you should throw that on the board. See what you get. A little prize.
We won't get one before that first game week, right? Like, that'll be the first time that comes out.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think they'll name the starter at QB until then too, but publicly.
Yeah. Well, yeah. All right. Anything else you want to add here on today's podcast? Covered a lot of ground.
We did. We covered enough ground for me to zip my lips now.
Okay. All right. Well, if you want more from BC, you can always find that at Husker247.com. He is writing like 5 articles a day. The man is at every press conference. He's at every media availability. He is the quintessential Nebraska beat writer. And in addition to that, you get Michael Bruntz too. You get a double dose of Nebraska beat writing when it comes to Husker 24/7. I throw in my own commentary. If you want it, great. If you don't have to read it. That's the beautiful thing about what we have going on at Husker247.com. So be sure to stop by, check that out. We always have deals going on. We always have great conversations happening in the Boneyard. So be sure to visit Husker247.com before the season starts. That way you'll be in the know. We'll catch you next week with another Husker 24/7 podcast.